Join me as I take on the challenge of participating in dark rituals and see what happens next. Dark rituals have been a part of human history for centuries, evoking a sense of mystery and intrigue in many of us. From ancient civilizations to modern-day secret societies, these forbidden practices have been shrouded in secrecy, sparking both fascination and terror in those who dare to explore them. The potential dangers of participating in dark rituals cannot be overstated. Not only do they often involve morally reprehensible acts, but they also have the power to consume and destroy those who participate in them. So, why do people continue to be drawn to these forbidden practices? Is it the thrill of pushing the boundaries of what is considered acceptable, or the promise of gaining supernatural powers and insight? Many believe that participating in dark rituals offers a sense of control and agency in a chaotic world. Others see it as a means of self-discovery, a way to tap into the unknown and uncover hidden truths about themselves and the universe. But at what cost? The lines between right and wrong are often blurred, and the consequences of participating in these rituals can be devastating. For some, the allure of dark rituals lies in the promise of spiritual enlightenment and connection with a higher power. But what if this connection comes at the expense of one's own humanity? What if, in our quest for knowledge and power, we sacrifice our very souls? There are many types of dark rituals, each with its own unique purpose and set of consequences. From summoning demons to raising the dead, each ritual has its own distinct energy and vibe. But what about the psychological implications of engaging in these practices? Do they offer a means of self-empowerment, or do they slowly erode our sense of self, leading us down a path of destruction and despair? Take, for instance, the ritual of demon summoning. This ancient practice requires a deep understanding of the occult, as well as a sense of courage and reckless abandon. But what happens when we succeed in summoning a demon? Are we prepared to face the consequences of our actions, or do we naively believe that we can control the forces of darkness? The ritual of raising the dead is another example of the supernatural implications of dark rituals. This practice requires a deep understanding of the afterlife, as well as a sense of respect for the dead. But what happens when we bring back the spirits of the deceased? Do we truly understand the nature of death? Or do we simply see it as a means of gaining power and knowledge? I want to share with you a shocking story that highlights the dangers of participating in dark rituals. It's a story about a young woman named Sarah, who became obsessed with the occult. She spent years studying the ancient art of demon summoning, convinced that she could control the forces of darkness. But as she delved deeper into the practice, she began to lose touch with reality. Sarah's friends and family grew increasingly concerned as she became more and more isolated, spending hours alone in her room, conjuring spirits and demons. But Sarah was convinced that she was on the path to enlightenment, that she was unlocking the secrets of the universe. That was until the day she summoned a demon that she couldn't control. The consequences were devastating. Sarah was found catatonic, her mind shattered by the horror she had unleashed. She spent years in a psychiatric hospital, struggling to come to terms with what she had done. Her story serves as a warning, a reminder of the dangers of participating in dark rituals. In conclusion, dark rituals offer a glimpse into the unknown, a promise of power and knowledge that is both alluring and terrifying. While they may hold a certain appeal, it's essential that we approach them with caution, recognizing the potential dangers and moral dilemmas that they pose. Thanks for watching. And if you have any thoughts on dark rituals, be sure to share them in the comments below. If you're interested in exploring more intriguing topics, be sure to check out my other videos, where I dive into the world of the unknown and the unexplained. Part 1. The Whisper of Shadows. I never believed in magic. Not in the Harry Potter kind anyway. Sure, I went through the phase as a teenager watching horror movies, diving into urban legends, trying Ouija boards at sleepovers. But I never actually believed any of it would work. Nothing out there could make sense of the chaos in our lives. Not back then anyway. That all changed the night I met Sarah. Sarah was unusual. We were both new to university and wound up in the same philosophy class. She sat in the back, always watching, hardly ever speaking. And when she did, it was usually to mutter some obscure reference that only seemed to make sense to her. She was the type you couldn't help but notice, even if you wanted to. Our paths crossed by accident. A downpour that left us huddled under the same ancient bus stop, the same night I missed my last bus. She wore all black, her hood pulled tight around her face, but something about her eyes felt off. It was as if they weren't meant for this world. As we stood there in the rain, she turned to me and whispered, "Have you ever wanted to know the truth?" Her voice sounded wrong, like it was layered with a faint hum, almost like a tape recording. I remember laughing, brushing it off as something cryptic and edgy, but she only stared, unfazed. "I'm serious. The truth is out there, but it isn't free." I didn't believe her. But she insisted, saying that if I was curious, if I really wanted to understand, she could show me a place where I could see the world through different eyes. The invitation was so casual, it felt like she was offering me a cigarette, not a look into whatever bizarre secrets she claimed to know. That should have been my first warning. "Meet me at the clock tower tomorrow night." "Midnight," she said. Before I could answer, she disappeared into the rain-soaked night, her footsteps soundless as if she'd never been there at all. That night I lay awake, her words echoing in my mind. It was ridiculous, of course, this whole cloak and dagger nonsense. But curiosity ate at me, gnawed through my nerves, and by the next day, I'd convinced myself it couldn't hurt to see what she had in mind. Part 2. The gathering shadows. The clock tower loomed over campus like a forgotten monument. Its shadow stretched across the quad, heavy and solid under the dim glow of the lamps. Midnight was marked by a single, echoing chime as I made my way up the creaking stairs to the top. Sarah was already there, perched on the edge of the narrow balcony, peering down at the darkened campus below. She didn't turn as I approached, but I knew she was aware of me somehow. I could feel her watching, even without her eyes on me. She finally spoke, her voice low, almost reverent. "Most people live their whole lives afraid of darkness, not just of what it hides, but of what it offers. It's fear that keeps them blind. Fear keeps them ordinary." Her words hung in the air, colder than the night itself. I didn't reply, just looked down at the black notebook she held, the edges worn and smudged as if it had been handled by countless others. She must have seen me looking, because she held it out, wordlessly. "What is it?" I asked, taking it from her, feeling an odd weight to it that went beyond the physical. "A ritual," she replied simply. "Something older than gods, older than the stars. If done correctly, it opens a door to, well, something beyond the ordinary." My stomach twisted. I forced myself to laugh, hoping she'd crack a smile, admit it was all some elaborate joke. But her face remained blank, deadly serious. "What does it do?" I managed, flipping the book open. The pages were yellowed, covered in symbols and shapes I didn't recognize, circles within circles, strange runes, twisted words that seemed to change when I blinked. I felt the urge to close the book, but my hands stayed frozen, as if the weight of the ink itself held them in place. Sarah watched me with a strange light in her eyes. "You'll see," she murmured. "But only if you're brave enough to follow through." Some part of me wanted to throw the book off the edge of the tower, to watch it disappear into the night. But then I saw something, a small note scribbled in the corner of one page. It read, "For those willing to surrender, clarity awaits." I didn't understand, but those words rooted me to the spot. "I'm in," I heard myself say, though the words barely felt like mine. A slow smile spread across her face, like a twisted crescent moon. She moved closer, her gaze intense. "There's one more thing you should know before we start. This ritual, it requires sacrifice. And once you start, there's no turning back." I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. "What kind of sacrifice?" Sarah's eyes held mine. "You'll find out soon enough. Meet me tomorrow night. And bring something precious." She slipped past me, vanishing down the stairs before I could protest. I looked back at the campus, silent and dark, and for a moment, I thought I heard whispers in the wind, soft, guttural voices, calling my name. Part 3. The offering. The next day passed in a haze. I couldn't focus, my thoughts circling back to Sarah's words and that strange, cursed notebook. Something precious, she'd said. But what did that mean? A watch? A photograph? Nothing I owned felt like it would matter to something so ancient and mysterious. As midnight approached, I found myself standing alone in my room, staring down at the only thing that seemed significant enough, a silver locket my mother had given me just before she died. Inside, it held a photo of her, faded and worn, a tiny relic of a life long gone. The thought of sacrificing it filled me with a hollow ache, but something about the ritual demanded it, as though the locket itself was aware, urging me on. When I arrived at the clock tower, Sarah was waiting, her silhouette barely visible in the shadows. She was already tracing a circle on the ground with something dark and grainy, her movements swift and precise. "You came," she said, glancing up with a satisfied smile. "And you brought an offering." I held up the locket. "This is it. It's important to me." She looked at it with a strange mix of interest and pity. "Perfect. It's important to them too." "Who's them?" I asked, my voice faltering. But she didn't answer. Instead, she motioned for me to sit across from her. And as I did, she handed me the notebook. "Read these words," she said, her voice lowering to a whisper, "and don't stop, no matter what happens." The symbols on the page swirled, seeming to move and twist as I tried to focus on them. The words themselves were almost unreadable. A mix of languages I didn't know and strange shapes that didn't belong together. But something in my mind seemed to understand, as if they'd been etched there long before I'd ever seen the book. I took a breath and started to read. The words came out in a whisper, thick and slow, each one leaving a metallic taste in my mouth. The air around us grew heavier, the silence somehow louder, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Then I felt it. Something shifting, pressing against the air, as though an unseen presence was drawing closer. Sarah's eyes widened, her face cast in an eerie light as she held the locket in her hands, raising it above her head. The silence shattered. A low, guttural hum filled the space around us, resonating through the stone walls of the clock tower. Shadows began to dance in the darkness, their movements erratic, almost human. I couldn't tear my eyes away from them, couldn't stop reading the words that seemed to pour out of my mouth against my will. And then I saw it, an outline forming in the center of the circle. It started as a faint shimmer, like heat rising from the ground, but slowly took shape, an impossible, elongated figure that seemed to defy every law of nature. Sarah's voice rang out, louder than the hum. "Offer your memory, your past, your connection. Surrender your precious token, and it will reveal its secrets." I glanced down at the locket, feeling a surge of panic. Memories of my mother, of our life together, flooded back, warm and familiar. But beneath it, I felt something cold and ancient, lurking, waiting. My hand trembled, and my grip on the locket tightened. But the shadows around me, they shifted, seeming to close in. Something told me that if I didn't offer it, they would take much more than the locket. I swallowed and forced myself to let go, setting the locket in the center of the circle. As it hit the ground, the hum crescendoed into a deafening roar, and the shadows coiled around it, twisting and convulsing. The locket melted into the stone, leaving nothing behind but a faint, shimmering mark, like an imprint of something that had never existed. The roar faded, leaving a silence so complete it felt like I'd gone deaf. Sarah reached over, touching my shoulder, her voice barely audible in the dark. "It's done," she whispered. "You've opened the door." A chill ran through me as I looked at her. What did we just let in? But Sarah's eyes were different now. They gleamed, reflecting something dark and endless. She looked at me with a smirk, as though she knew a terrible secret that I could never understand. "Not what?" she murmured. "But who?" Part 4. The Descent. For days after the ritual, I tried to convince myself it had all been a dream, some vivid nightmare sparked by stress or lack of sleep. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadows coiling around that circle, swallowing my mother's locket as if it had never existed. Worse still was Sarah's expression, her eyes, shining with something too dark to be human. I couldn't shake it. As the days wore on, strange things began happening. It started small. Shadows moved where they shouldn't, and I'd catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a figure lingering just beyond sight, a whisper so faint it was like a memory slipping away. My dreams became plagued with strange symbols, distorted voices calling out in languages I'd never heard. But then, things took a darker turn. One night, as I lay awake in bed, I heard a faint tapping, coming from somewhere deep within the walls. It was rhythmic, slow, almost patient, like someone knocking to the beat of a twisted melody only they could hear. I held my breath, waiting, but it didn't stop. It continued, growing louder, closer, until it sounded as if someone was knocking just outside my door. I shot up in bed, heart hammering. The knocking ceased, replaced by silence so thick it felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. And then, out of the darkness, a whisper cut through the silence, cold and hollow. "Do you want to know?" The voice was unlike anything I'd heard before, layered, as if several people were speaking at once. I gripped the edge of the bed, paralyzed. "No, what?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. It didn't answer, but I felt something, a presence, cold and ancient, watching, waiting. The air around me grew thick with a suffocating dread, and I knew somehow that whatever I had released that night in the clock tower had followed me home. The next day, I searched for Sarah. I needed answers. I spent hours scouring the campus, asking classmates if they'd seen her, but no one seemed to know where she was. It was as if she disappeared without a trace. Desperation drove me to the library, to the archives buried in the basement. I started combing through old newspapers, anything that could tell me what I was dealing with. I searched through records of strange occurrences, disappearances, but nothing seemed to match, until I found a small, faded article from decades ago. The headline read, "Student dies in ritual gone wrong, clock tower closed indefinitely." My breath caught in my throat. The article was vague, clearly written to avoid panic, but it mentioned a ritual held in the clock tower, a supposed attempt to contact something beyond human understanding. The student had died under mysterious circumstances, though officials dismissed it as an accident. But the part that made my skin crawl was a single line from a witness. I heard her whispering, "Do you want to know?" My blood ran cold. I knew then that I was following the same path, repeating a ritual that was never meant to be performed. That night, as I lay in bed, the knocking began again, louder this time, more insistent. But it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from inside the room. I sat up, scanning the darkness, my pulse pounding. And then, from the shadows, I saw it, a figure, tall and gaunt, its eyes hollow voids that seemed to devour the light. It stood at the edge of my bed, its face twisted into a grin too wide to be human. "Do you want to know?" it whispered, the words dripping like venom. I couldn't speak, couldn't move. I could only stare as it leaned closer, its breath cold against my face, reeking of something ancient and decayed. It reached out a hand, its fingers long and skeletal, hovering inches from my chest. I could feel something pulling at me, like it was reaching into my very soul, ripping at memories and feelings, pulling me into an endless void. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, leaving only a single word whispered in the silence. "Soon," I gasped, clutching at my chest, feeling my heartbeat stuttering irregular, as if something inside me was slowly unraveling. Whatever I had invited in wasn't just haunting me. It was binding itself to me, feeding on me, and I had no idea how to stop it. Part 5. The last rite. Sleep was no refuge anymore. Each night, the knocking grew louder, the whispers more insistent, the shadowed figure creeping ever closer. I was losing weight. My reflection seemed wrong eyes sunken, skin graying. I could almost feel something clawing at me from the inside, scraping away parts of myself I hadn't even realized were there. But it was Sarah's final appearance that shattered any illusions of escape. One evening, as I stumbled back to my apartment from another sleepless night in the library, I found her waiting in the shadows outside my door. She looked different, hollowed out, her once piercing eyes dull and faded, but her lips twisted in that same knowing smirk. "Is it what you thought it would be?" she asked, her voice low and tainted with something almost sympathetic. "Sarah," I whispered, fighting the urge to back away. "What is this? What did you do to me?" She tilted her head, her gaze unfocused, almost like she wasn't really seeing me. "I opened the door," she said softly. "I showed you the way. What's happening now? That's between you and them. Them. You keep saying that, but what are they?" Her smirk widened, twisting into something bitter and resigned. "They're what's always been there, waiting, watching. You wanted to see the truth, didn't you? To understand." She leaned closer, her voice a low hiss. "This is the price. There's always a price." I reached out, grabbing her arm, desperate. "Sarah, please. There has to be a way to stop this. Some way to close the door." For the first time, her expression softened, just a flicker of pity. "There is," she said. "But it's not the kind of price you'd want to pay." I didn't care. I would have given anything to end this nightmare. "Tell me. Whatever it takes. Just tell me." She took a long, shaky breath, then pulled something from her pocket and pressed it into my hand, a folded scrap of paper, worn and yellowed. "You'll need to finish the ritual," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But this time, you'll need something more than just a locket or a token." I unfolded the paper, squinting in the dim light to make out the handwritten scrawl. It was a set of instructions similar to the pages I'd read from before, but much darker. My stomach twisted as I read the final line. "The door can be closed only by the one who opened it, through the ultimate offering, a piece of themselves." I looked back up at her, horrified. "A piece of? What does that mean?" Sarah's gaze was empty, resigned. "It means exactly what it says. You have to give them something they can truly devour.
Something that ties you to this world.
She let out a hollow laugh. Trust me, they'll take whatever you offer willingly. I felt my mind spiral. The weight of what she was saying crashing down on me.
A piece of myself. A memory. A hope. Something fundamental that couldn't be replaced.
There's no other way,
I asked, my voice barely audible. She shook her head, her eyes gleaming with something dark.
There's never been any other way.
Then, as suddenly as she'd appeared, Sarah turned and vanished into the shadows, leaving me standing there, clutching the instructions to the final rite. That night, I prepared myself, reading through the ritual's instructions until I could barely see straight.
The last line repeated itself in my mind over and over. Sacrifice what anchors you to this world. At midnight, I returned to the clock tower, the final page in hand. The air was thick, silent, like the calm before a storm, and I felt them, the shadows, watching, waiting for me to complete what I'd started. I began the chant, my voice echoing through the empty tower. The shadows stirred, curling and coiling around me, and I could feel them pressing against the thin fabric of reality, eager, hungry. When I finished the final line, a voice, the same layered, inhuman voice I'd heard before, whispered from the darkness.
What will you give, little one?
My throat tightened, and my gaze dropped to the floor.
I knew what I had to do, but the weight of it made my knees weak. With a shaking hand, I pulled my mother's picture from my pocket.
The image was already fading, almost translucent, a sign of how deeply they'd already begun to feed on me.
I'll give you. My voice broke, and I felt tears welling up.
I'll give you the memory of her.
The air grew cold, and I felt a pull, like icy fingers wrapping around my chest, squeezing, extracting.
Pain lanced through me, sharp and unrelenting, as the memory of my mother began to unravel. Her laugh, her scent, the warmth of her touch, all of it slipping away, unraveling into nothingness. The shadows coiled tighter, devouring the memory piece by piece, until there was nothing left but a dull ache, an emptiness I couldn't place. The air grew still again, and then, one by one, the shadows receded, slinking back into the darkness.
The door, it seemed, had closed.
In the days that followed, I felt like a hollow shell, walking through life in a daze. There was a gap in my mind, a part of me that felt torn away, but I couldn't remember why. Every time I tried to focus, to remember, I'd be met with a strange emptiness, as if a part of me had simply ceased to exist. Sarah disappeared after that. No one seemed to remember her, as if she'd been nothing but a shadow passing through. I asked around, but her name faded from people's minds like a half-formed thought, until I was the only one left with even a hazy recollection of her face. And sometimes, late at night, I would hear it, a faint, rhythmic knocking, coming from the shadows of my empty room.
A reminder, perhaps, that the door was never truly closed.
Only waiting.